everyone, and welcome to Fresh Waves. I'm your host, Bren Masson, and today on Fresh Waves, we're going to have a conversation with Sue Reynolds about therapeutic writing. Writing for yourself. Writing to express yourself and how you feel for no one else. Now, on Wednesday, we talked with Sue about becoming an author, how to start your first novel, and maybe become a New York Times bestseller. Well, today we're talking about writing just for you. During this pandemic, you may need an outlet for some of your feelings, something that you can't express to everybody who's around you. This is a great show with some really great tips. If you'd like to hear Wednesday's show again, we podcast our shows on freshwaves.ca. Enjoy the show. Writing can be so wonderful in so many ways. I suggested to someone last year that they start to journal, that maybe this will help them get through what they were trying to express, what they were trying to feel. And this woman's response was, "Oh, I do that already. I'm writing, I journal every day so that when I'm not here, my children will have my story." But that's not journaling. That's memoirs. That's writing your life story. Journaling and therapeutic writing is a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you want to write for therapeutic benefit, I mean, one of the first things is that you're writing only for yourself. You're putting your voice, your experiences, your feelings in particular. I said it in the last hour when I was talking about writing fiction, that you should not be telling the readers how people feel. But if you're writing for yourself, it's almost crucial that you write how you feel. It's one of the ways you can, debrief yourself from your own life, is connect with what's going on with you at a feeling level. Mm-hmm. So,
and then in so doing, you can often express yourself in a way that you can't in any other way in our society.
That's a great point. For a lot of the writers who come to my workshops who just really need to get their stories out of their cells, out of their bodies and onto paper, they talk about the relief of being in a writing group like that, where there's a formula, a format for holding the space and keeping it safe. They talk about the relief of having a place to bring their emotions. So, for instance, this fall I'll be doing a workshop at the hospice up in Georgina for bereaved caregivers. Writing to deal with grief is a fantastic way of coping, because when you're out in the real world, people don't want to hear that you feel bad. I mean, if you lose somebody for the next sort of 2-3 weeks, they'll be like, "How are you doing?" And then after that, they don't want to hear that, you're really engaged with grief. And yet grief is like it's a person's worst nightmare to go into a general meeting and have someone say, "So how are you?" And the person says, "Not good at all." Oh, well, they turn around, they walk to somebody else. I'm sorry to hear that, right?
Yeah. Bye.
And then, so, to have a place to put your feelings of, depression, anger, irritation, loneliness, all of those things that we think of as dark or sad or difficult.
The vulnerable feelings.
The vulnerable feelings. This is not a culture that celebrates being vulnerable or that can hold space for someone. It's a real gift to be able to hold space for someone who's going through something difficult without interfering, without wanting, we want to comfort them. We want them to feel better. Mm-hmm. It's hard to witness somebody feeling sad or lonely or whatever. We are empathetic creatures. So then we begin to feel that, right? Which means that we have to have a tolerance for our own sadness, our own loneliness, our own anger, our own unhappiness. So in a writing group where there's a structure. So people write together and then they read, and then witnessing is done, feedback is done in a way that doesn't interfere with their process, but that just simply witnesses it and validates it. Mm-hmm. I heard this. This was strong for me. This really impressed me in that writing. This stays with me. I can feel the heaviness in my chest, right? And not judged, just held. It's such an incredibly powerful experience. I realize I've gotten into writing together for therapy, whereas you were talking about just writing for yourself. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, that is just writing for yourself, because you're not doing it to impress anybody. You're just doing it to get it on the page and then actually get it out into the air. And
in these workshops, it's always up to you, isn't it, if you choose to share or not?
Absolutely. And it also depends on the workshop, the intention of the workshop. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are workshops out there that are for critiquing, that are for preparing that second draft we talked about, that are about polishing the work to send it out into the world for critical assessment. But what I'm talking about is a first draft process where you're sitting down, in a circle of other writers who are equally vulnerable, and putting down on paper what you really want to put down. In the AWA method, the first thing we talk about is confidentiality, and the first rule of the confidentiality is that you don't have to you don't have to read if you don't want to read.
Right.
The most important thing is that you know you have a safe place to put it down, and sometimes that safety means that you have no intention of sharing it, and that's fine.
Right. And it's interesting because in the AWA also, not only do you not have to share, but when comments are made about the writing, it's about the writing.
Yes.
It's not about the person.
It's not about the person's, personal story. We never assume that the character that's in the piece of writing, even if the author has written it in the I voice, I did this, person, I did that. We never assume that character in that I voice is the writer that's sitting on the other side of the room. We talk about, how does this affect me as a piece of writing? Where was I engaged with it emotionally? And how did I feel in response to it? What was strong in it? What was beautifully worded? All the feedback we give initially is about the strengths of the work, and all the feedback we give always is about how effective it is as a piece of writing.
Mm-hmm. As I go, because one of the strongest things a person can do sometimes when holding space for another to write or to express themselves is to not judge, but to just acknowledge that the person has spoken, that there has been an expression of some kind. And in a lot of different techniques, it's just simply And sometimes, even in a written piece, when you read an author's work, and is there in the, HMMM, or however they spell it, to phonetically present that kind of response. It's so powerful. In its simplicity, it's so powerful. Silence can often be frightening.
Right.
And then a person doesn't know if they've been heard. But then to acknowledge the hearing without judging, that's a skill. And I find good facilitators have that skill.
I'll share a technique with you. I talked about Natalie Goldberg, studying with her back in the 90s. In her workshops, she asks for recall. So not feedback, but recall. And what she says is to give back to the writer in words as close as you can to the way they wrote it, what you heard. So people start calling out, just phrases and single words or sentences from what they heard, but they're reproducing it exactly in the writer's words. So there's no judgment. It's like mirroring, right? The red wheelbarrow, the white chickens, right? And that is actually incredibly affirming and validating, just to hear that you put words out there and that they stuck, People took them in, and going back to the PET scan, we talked about that that those images bloomed in the reader's mind or the listener's mind. They had a reaction. It stayed with them, right? It's incredibly powerful to know that your words did something for someone.
And then what did they do for you? I mean, in terms of the person who comes into, someone can be listening to this show right now and say, oh, I'm going to go to a yoga retreat. I'm going to a drumming retreat. Why would I ever go to a writing retreat? I don't want to sit at a desk and write for a whole weekend. That would be awful.
Yeah. For some people, they do imagine it's going to be like homework, right?
Right.
Yeah, or it's going to be work. I mean, almost every holiday I take, I go somewhere and I do a writing retreat. When I tell people what I'm doing, they're like, what? It's like, you sit at a computer all the time. Like, what are you doing? But it's like a deep sweet conversation with yourself. It's tremendously self-affirming, self-compassionate. It's a very loving way to be with yourself, to witness your own words. And again, that very non-judgmental, that delicious discovery that, like, I didn't know that's what I thought. You know how sometimes you can be with a friend and you'll be talking about something difficult for yourself, and in that conversation you discover answers, things that you didn't know you had, right? And you couldn't have gotten there without that conversation. The thing is, with your journal, you can have exactly that same kind of conversation with yourself, and you can also make those leaps of insight and get to understanding and discovery that you couldn't get to just thinking, you know, in the hamster wheel of the mind.
The hamster wheel of the mind. Sometimes that process of taking that busy brain that just, like you said, is that wheel that's going around and around and around, and putting that down on paper. I'm stunned sometimes when I go back into my work and look at what I have written 5 years ago, 2 months ago. I remember Julie McIntyre in the Expressive Arts course saying she received a poem from someone, one of her students, and the student said, "I'm not sure who wrote this. Can you please tell me the author of this poem?" And then laid out the poem in the email. And Julie's laughing to herself and responded, "It was you."
Yeah.
And the reason you have no author at the bottom of that piece is because you wrote that when you were in class. It's so staggering. Funny. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
You know, that you look back and you think, wow.
Yeah, it is like a conversation. Only, you know, with that sort of deep part of yourself that you don't engage with in other ways. If you're interested, I can talk a little bit about the research about the therapeutic value of writing.
I would love to hear that.
So back in the 80s, there was a professor in Austin, Texas, at a small Methodist university. He was doing research into PTSD and disclosure. And so he found this really interesting correlation that people who had experienced traumatic events in their lives were, not surprisingly, you know, there was a residual stress associated with it that eventually was likely to resolve in, or more likely to resolve in chronic disease, early death. You know, it had a negative health effect, having had a traumatic experience happen. But then he discovered this group of outliers. If they had had a traumatic experience and never shared it with anybody, they were, massively, significantly more likely to develop chronic disease and die early. So he thought that's pretty interesting. So he did an experiment with students at the university. He divided them into groups, and one group wrote, but they just wrote kind of essay topics, you know, setting up my schedule for school, you know, what I intend to do this year, that kind of thing. The other group, he encouraged them to write about things that had happened to them that were distressing or dismaying and that they had never told anyone. He had them write for 20 minutes a day for 4 days in a row. They deposited their work anonymously into a big drum, so they didn't sign it. They, you know, nobody was going to associate it with them. And then, because it was a small Methodist university and people were on campus and really didn't leave, he was able to track their health over the next 6 months. And he discovered that the students who had disclosed, who had written things that distressed and dismayed them for the first time, that they were almost 50% less likely to develop you know, the kinds of stress-related things like colds, flus, upper respiratory things, than the group who had just written kind of essay topics. So then he got really interested in that. He published those findings, and other people got really interested in that. They did some more experiments around that. They paired up with the School of Nursing, and they did immunological assays after the therapeutic writing, and they discovered that people's white blood cell count went up. So their immune systems were strengthened when they wrote in ways that were disclosing what was distressing to them.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Then they published those, and other researchers got on board. They began doing writing experiments with people who were suffering from anxiety, suffering from depression. They did it with breast cancer patients. They did it with heart attack survivors. They did some things like they did it there was a group of men who had been suddenly let go from their jobs, like shockingly they weren't prepared for this. Mm-hmm. They divided them into two groups. Again, one group just sort of wrote, they just wrote, but it wasn't about what had happened to them. The other group processed what had happened to them. And I think a year later, it was a year or 6 months later, almost all the men who were in the writing, the processing group were rehired, had moved on, were, engaged with their lives in meaningful ways again. And the group that had not written the disclosing material, they were still bitter and struggling and having a hard time. Most of them were not rehired. Like the curves were quite extraordinary. So, over and over and over again, there are tons of experiments that have been done in this way. In almost every instance, the results are quite significant, that writing down what distresses and dismays you has a positive effect on your health, your mental health, your life situation, and it's scientific research with statistics.
Wow.
Yeah. That's
great. Mm-hmm. It's nice. People like to have the research behind the sort of, I've had my own experience with the writing. I've seen what it can do for other people, what it can do for myself. But there's the world around that needs the science to back it up before they'll listen to it. I think that's why Brené Brown is so successful, is that she has the research. She said, so I thought of the concept, or I heard somebody mention it. So I went and did the research, and 4 years later, then she produces another book or another concept, and that it gives it the credibility that people are looking for to validate the reason why they would go to a writing workshop. So I just asked you, there's all these different workshops to go to. Why would I go to a writing workshop? Well, that's a really good reason why, is that it really can improve your mental state. It really can.
Yeah. And that's the writing that you just do for yourself, right? Yeah. That's that writing with no pressure. It's just to be in conversation with yourself, to explore what you're feeling, how you've reacted to something, what's going on for you. It's never going to be published, but it has incredible value just for your own health.
And that's the most important value there is.
Yeah, right? Ultimately.
Yeah. I heard a great analogy that if you're, you have to consider yourself like an hourglass. And the hourglass, it works really well when it has the right balance of things. But it has to be right inside before it can work outside. So whatever goes out the top of it, whatever is excess from what's in the hourglass, is for everybody else. Mm. But your hourglass has to be filled with the right amount of stuff in order for it to work properly.
Interesting.
I find at these writing workshops that not only does it really help you with what you've written, but hearing what other people have written is inspiring. It's awesome in the true word of the word awesome, which is sometimes very scary, but it's wonderful. It's organic, it's raw, it's honest. It's wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Well, and you can learn so much about craft from paying close attention to others' work, right? You'll hear how they've employed metaphor, for instance, and if you're not a person who normally works with metaphor, you can see how powerful that is, or you'll see somebody who's very skilled at dialogue, right? And you'll be inspired to try some dialogue in your own work. That's one of the things I love about the AWA workshops, is that our emphasis on craft is so often based in the work that people are producing, and we learn so much from each other. Mm-hmm.
Now, when you're writing this for your awful first draft, or you're writing for therapeutic value, you're not looking at grammar and sentence structure.
Absolutely not. In fact, Pennebaker's protocol, the 4 days, 20 minutes a day, one of the first things he says is, you don't worry about spelling, sentence structure, syntax, grammar, punctuation. You're only writing it for yourself as long as you can read it. In fact, you don't even have to read it once you've written it. There's something about getting the story out of your body that is the thing that induces health. So Pennebaker also did these experiments where he had people this was not about writing. This was about disclosure. He had people sit in a small room with a shower curtain across the middle of the room. Mm-hmm. There was nobody on the other side of the shower curtain. I mean, this is kind of confessional feel to this, right? But
right.
There was nobody on the other side. The people sat on a stool and they just told their stories to the room. And there was another group that he worked with where he had them write on. Do you remember those magic slates?
Yes.
From, you get them at the dollar store, right? A waxy tablet with a plastic thing over it, and you write it on, and then you pull up the plastic top and it disappears, right? Mm-hmm. So he had people write their material that was distressing on those, and then it was gone, right? But the point is, they had expressed it. They had spoken into the air, they had written on the thing, and he tracked their health. And they had the same kinds of benefits that the people who wrote on paper did. It's the act of getting it out of your body.
Right, it's the poesis.
Expressing it, right?
Yes.
The expressive arts.
Right, and the poesis. It's the process of getting to that end product, not the end product itself that really matters. It's the getting there. It's the journey. Right. It's the journey. Somebody should write a song about that or name a group after that. Anyway, we've got to take a little break and pay some bills here at the station. You're listening to Fresh Waves on Whistle FM. And our guest this morning is Sue Reynolds. We'll be back with some more interesting stuff about therapeutic writing right after this. Stay tuned. We're back on Fresh Waves. We're talking with Sue Reynolds about therapeutic writing. And you run a lot of workshops.
I do. Mm-hmm.
In the writing world, both for the person who wants to be the next Dan Brown or J.K. Rowling, but also for therapeutic reasons. Mm-hmm. So you are a psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. How was that? Was that a good education? Pretty
fascinating, and it never stops, right?
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I would say that that's one of the richest and most satisfying arenas of my life. But I'll also say that it's intimately engaged with the writing world that I do. I won't say I can't separate them. I mean, clearly I can make a separation, but so often, I mean, we're talking about story, right?
So they're intertwined.
Absolutely. Yeah. People's stories, the way they regard themselves, the narrative they have about themselves, it's intimately locked up with how they feel about themselves, how they interact with the world. And if you can affect how the story someone's telling themselves about themselves, you can affect the way they engage with their lives. For sure. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because in the author world, in days of old, when people wrote under pseudonyms, and there was a culture that sort of told the story that authors were weird individuals. They were all eccentric. They were all strange. They were, men writing with women's names, women writing under men's names, and trying to be these people that they really weren't. And even Hemingway, he had all these mental issues throughout his entire life. And there's even movies about authors just being completely odd individuals, definitely off the grid. So, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. No. Really well put together, quote unquote, and I hate doing that because I don't even like it in real life, the little finger things, but what people consider to be average, normal people can be wonderful authors.
Absolutely. Although I often think the drive to write, initially comes from, maybe not having had the perfect, childhood where you were properly mirrored, where your parents were really focused on, validating, that you had a right to your own thoughts, opinions, feelings, and so on. And I think often people who turn to writing as a way, to be heard, to hear themselves, it's because they haven't had that experience as a child.
Interesting.
That's my theory.
Do they do therapeutic writing with children?
That's a really good question. I don't know of any. But of course, yeah. I mean, so often with young children, things are done in art. You'll know this.
Yes.
And then you get the child to tell you the story about the art verbally, right? But they don't necessarily have the writing skills.
Right.
I mean, so again, I'm going to pop back to the AWA method for a minute. I mean, one of our fundamental tenets is that if you write, you are a writer, right?
Yes.
So the thing is, I believe that if anybody is able to engage with literacy, and put their words down on paper, they can consider themselves a writer. Like they are engaged in the act of writing. So, yes. Ergo, right? Yeah.
Okay. So how would you conduct then, if someone is listening to this and they're thinking, well, maybe I would do a workshop in therapeutic writing. And they may think that they have had a trauma in the past, whether they've been diagnosed necessarily with post-traumatic stress disorder. I think there's a lot of people walking around out there who have PTSD who don't even know it. How would they picture what this workshop is going to do? Walk us through the steps of what a workshop looks like.
Okay. So, I'll talk about sort of a general workshop, and then I can talk specifically about writing if you've got PTSD.
Right, but sometimes, like I'm saying, people don't know that. They might discover it during your first workshop and then realize they have something to work on.
Right. So, if you're going to write in a workshop with, a number of writers around the table, and I'm going to say an AWA workshop, I've experienced lots of different kinds of workshops, but I am totally committed to this method because of the way it supports and makes a safe environment. So, there'll be the normal kind of group activity. We'll make sure that everybody understands the guidelines, how we're going to keep the space safe. And then I will offer a prompt. It's, sometimes I read a poem. Sometimes I, will, as we did earlier in the set, offer a sensory-based thing. I might start with, actually, I'll just take a little sidebar for a moment and offer you something that Natalie Goldberg gave us way back when in the workshops. She said, if you're stuck for a place to start, there are always 3 places you can begin. One is begin with the words I remember, right? And the thing is, even if you don't know immediately what comes after that, you can say, I remember. Wait, I remember. If you keep faithful to the pen moving across the page, your brain is going to supply the next thing, right? It gets bored really fast. There's if anybody is listening who's a meditator, you know that your brain never shuts up. So you go, I remember. You'll go to, I remember the way the earthworms would crawl out of the ground when there was a heavy rain. I remember the smell in the air after a heavy rain. I remember the dots in the top of my sandals, my little red leather shoes. I remember, and you can start with that kind of disconnected, I remember this, I remember that, and connecting back in a sensory way to your childhood, to your experience, your teenagehood, your young marriedhood, your being in school, whatever. And if you stay faithful to that and you just keep your hand moving, your brain will start to fill in what it wants you to connect to. So that's a kind of general thing, right? So I remember I'm looking at.
Yeah.
So I could start, I'm looking at Brenda's tanned arm on the other side of the table. I'm looking at the bracelet of blue stones. And then before you know it, I'm connecting to a time where I was, in Northern Ontario, mining for amethyst. I'm immediately I start to connect to my own life and I go sideways. Like the prompt is only ever a diving board to get you into the thing. Right. Into the story. So I'll offer a prompt and I always say to people, I'm going to offer something. If it's not working for you, start there. Say, I have no idea what to do with what she just gave me. Why did I sign up for this workshop? Everybody else's pens are flying.
What a waste of time.
Exactly. But the thing is, you don't do that in your head. You do it on the page, right? You commit to moving your hand across the page. And again, your brain will not shut up, right? It's like, okay, enough with this, objecting. What do you really want to write about? And, what I really want to write about is, what my neighbor said to me yesterday. And you're off, right?
Right.
often when we finish writing together, people will say, "Oh, I didn't do this right," right? But then there's no way to do it wrong, right? If you're engaging with what your brain gives you, you're doing it perfectly. If you're moving your hand across the page, capturing your thoughts, capturing your ideas, capturing that inner discussion, you're doing it perfectly. And the last one is, I'm thinking about. Or I'm thinking of.
Oh my.
Yeah.
That could be a 400 pager.
Exactly. So there's three, you never have to be without some place to start if you've got those three little prompts, right?
That's true. Okay. So you would start these writing exercises. Do they have 2 hours to write?
No, in a class, 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. You set your timer, and for that length of time, you do not let your hand stop moving. You're writing, even if it's objecting, right? Even if it's, I've come to the end of what I had to say. When is the bell going to go? I don't want to be doing this.
You don't get one of those clocks that goes tick, tick.
No, you don't get one of those.
Okay, so you keep saying your hand is moving, you never stop writing.
Exactly.
Does that mean that these workshops where you're doing therapeutic writing don't involve people typing on a laptop?
No, typing on a laptop is fine too, although I am a big advocate of writing by hand. I think the brain operates differently when you write by hand. Mm-hmm. And also the thing with a laptop is the editing is just right there, right? It's so easy to think, no, I want to change that. You just cross it out, go back. Whereas if you're writing, if you're committed on the page, you tend to keep the flow going. So, I'm not a big fan of people doing first draft writing on a laptop. Now, sometimes people have mobility issues. They really need that, and that's great. But if you can, I really believe in pen on paper. So, we do that. I'll give them a warning when we're almost at the end of the time so that they just know to, sort of finish that sentence, finish that thought. We offer the optional reading and feedback, and we go from there. Sometimes, often actually, people, when they choose to read aloud, like my lawyer example from earlier, they cry spontaneously. They don't even feel like there was anything sad about what they wrote, but it's connecting to something that they're feeling that they're out of touch with. Right? Just somehow moving that through this space in the throat, mm-hmm. which is of course also the space where you feel grief. You know that feeling yes. where you're about to cry and you feel like you've got that chicken bone stuck sideways in your throat?
Absolutely.
So there's something about moving the words, moving the story through that space that can trigger tears. And in that case, in the workshop, we just hold the space. We nobody runs over and hugs them. Nobody shoves Kleenex at them. Nobody pats them on the, we just wait. We trust that the person is able to, go where they needed to go. Their brain gave them the mm-hmm. words. They say it. And inevitably, I haven't talked in here yet about the fact that I've been, offering, writing workshops in the jail with incarcerated women for the last 13 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I actually did my undergrad thesis on that program. And the women say, well, first of all, incarcerated women aren't supposed to show negative emotions. I mean, we talk about, not having a place to put negative emotions here in the outside world. Yes. In there's a much bigger embargo on the negative emotions. They talk about what a relief it is, how surprised they were that they cried, what a relief it is that they cried. They hate doing it while they do it, but they say, I felt so much lighter when I left the workshop. And it was a place that I could do it and it was okay, right? Mm-hmm. If I want to cry outside of here, I have to go in the shower so nobody knows I'm doing it.
Odd. That's a weird culture when you think that it's all women.
Yeah, well, they're carrying a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a general writing workshop, and even there's a lot of sort of unexpected therapy that happens just simply by getting in touch with one's story. It's funny, actually, people sometimes cry even when they're writing fiction, right? They empathetically connect to their characters and the story, and they're moved to tears. The thing is, if you are somebody who has had a traumatic experience and is suffering from PTSD, writing can be a very valuable way of getting in touch with what's gone on for you. People who've had PTSD experience the world differently. Things are often very chaotic in their brains. They have a lot of trouble kind of holding on to the linear thought patterns that the rest of us do, like things that are easy for us, deciding, how to get up in the morning, the order of things we're going to do, how to get out of the house, where to go here, what order we're going to do things in. That's a real effort and a struggle for them. And there's something about writing with trauma survivors. One of the reasons that Pennebaker put forward, one of the theories Pennebaker put forward for why writing is so therapeutic, is that when people have been through a chaotic experience and the chaos is still swirling in their heads because it hasn't ever been finalized, it hasn't ever been processed, when you write something, you have to do it in a linear fashion or it makes no sense, right? You have to put the words in a linear order or, you can't express yourself. So just the act of like, what word comes next? What word comes next? What do I have to say to complete this sentence? How am I going to tell this story? This sentence first, this word after this word after this word. It's actually imposing a structure on the experience that you haven't been able to impose on there when you've got that hamster wheel of your brain running around and around and around. Yeah. So
not interesting. So for PTSD, this is quite an effective therapy.
Yeah, there's a wonderful, if you're interested in PTSD, there's a wonderful, wonderful book by Besser van der Kolk, who is one of the premier researchers in PTSD. He's been doing it for 30 years. He's with, I think, University of Massachusetts. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And in that book, he's talking about, why regular psychotherapy doesn't work. Talk therapy doesn't work with PTSD survivors. And he talks about all the kinds of therapy that do work. And there's a big chapter in there on writing as a therapeutic practice with trauma survivors.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's
writing is a great thing. Writing is a great thing. Reading is a great thing.
Words are great things.
Yes.
Yeah, words are a way to transmit our experience, to build connection and build intimacy, to build community. I'm a huge believer in the transmission of words.
Yes, I think there's magic created in writing. And there's magic that happens when you do a writing workshop. It's interesting.
No question.
I really, really believe in the power of the written word in a psychotherapy sense. I think it really has a big impact. I mean, there are people who have huge moments when they do other aspects of expressive arts, but writing and music are the two that really seem to bring it out in people, that really give them the thing that they're looking for. Some people like to have music in the background when they're doing writing exercises, and it's really good to use instrumental music because it doesn't get you caught up in the language of the song when there's lyrics there that you're paying attention to, or foreign words in a language that you don't understand, because then the vocals actually become another instrument within the instrumentals because there's not an understanding of lyrics involved. So if somebody's been listening to the show and they want to know how to get a hold of you and how to take your workshops and when the next one is, and they're all gung-ho, give us some info.
Okay. So my primary website is actually, we're just changing servers right now. So right now, if you want to get to the website that's listing all the courses I'm doing this fall, you would go to inkslingers.xyz. Normally it's inkslingers.ca, but we're transitioning from that server. So that'll be repointed in a few days. But this morning, inkslingers.xyz would be the website you would go to. I'm teaching in Uxbridge this fall. I'm going to do a 6-week workshop at the end of October, starting October 31st, called A Novel Beginning. And that is just sort of about discovering how to discover story in your life, how to, those ideas that float through, those things you see, how to determine whether or not what you're thinking about is better suited to a short story or essay, or whether it's better suited to a longer project, like full-length memoir or a novel. We'll be developing those ideas in the course, and if people are interested in working on something short, we'll be polishing up a couple of stories that they might want to send out for publication, or developing the beginnings of something that'll be a long project. I'm also, every September, back to school time, I do something called a novel approach, which is a 10-month course to produce a full-length manuscript, either memoir or fiction. So that my course starts...
Nothing makes the writing go faster than a good deadline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's how this course is structured. Every 2 weeks, people are to produce 3,000 words. And by the end of the 10 months...
How many pages is 3,000 words?
12.
12, okay.
Double-spaced. So, I mean, you can do 12 double-spaced pages in a morning. But, going back to my earlier comment, I advocate doing it every day or every other day to do a smaller chunk, right? To keep in touch with those characters so they don't start looking at you with rage in their eyes. And over the course of a year or the 10 months, they produce, the students produce work of about 70,000 words, which is a great sort of first draft, full-length book.
Isn't that neat?
Yeah, my favorite, I do work with novelists, but I have to say my favorite for the year-long course are memoirists. And to go back to your thing about therapeutic writing, the testimonials that I get at the end of the year, I had, a couple of years ago, I had one woman say to me, I have been in therapy off and on all my life. And she had a difficult childhood. She said, this year of writing my story is the most therapeutic thing I've ever done.
So her novel was her own story?
Her memoir.
Her memoir.
She was writing a memoir.
Wow.
About her own life. Yeah, the memoirists are my favorite, but that's my bias as a psychotherapist, right? Another woman last year said, when I look back on my life, she was again saying how helpful writing her own story had been. And she said, when I look back on my life in years to come, I think it'll be that was pre-novel approach and that was post-novel approach. Like, it's really, to spend that long on your own story is profoundly affecting.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it's interesting that you said that. We usually put out at the beginning of the show, although we forgot to today, that anyone can send us their questions on Facebook, but I do that in my Facebook post the night before. And we've had someone that's just sent, I checked, and we've had a listener that just posted, I want to quit my job today. Am I being too impulsive? Should I write about this? What do you think?
Interesting. Absolutely.
We're coming up on lunchtime, so maybe she has an hour where she could sit down and do...
Absolutely. And a great place to start is with that sentence stem, right?
Right.
What would happen if I quit my job today? And then, have her just write it out. And particularly, I'm not quite sure that I put the emphasis on this that I need to. If you're interested in writing, expressively in writing to investigate your life, your psyche and so on, you want to check into the feelings, right? So what is it that has me feeling, it's important for me to quit my job right away? Mm-hmm. What would support me in this if I wanted to do this? What would be the challenges of wanting to do this? Once you start unpacking it and breaking it down, things that seemed impossible can seem a lot more possible, or that impulsive jump to do something like that, you begin to see, well, I can't actually quit my job today, but this is what I would need to put in place to give myself a year off or something like that, right? And you can begin to work towards it. Whereas if it's just that hamster on a wheel, thought going round and round, you can spin there for years and never make a move.
There's so much to ponder.
There is, yes.
And I guess that the point that we've been talking about all this morning and in this last hour, don't ponder so much. Write it down.
Yeah, ponder on the page.
Ponder on the page.
That transforms it.
That's a good idea. Ponder on the page. Okay, so you have lots of workshops coming up, and there seems to be lots of places for people to start. They don't have to jump into the deep end. They can just start dabbling on their own. There's a lot of journals out there right now. The 5-minute journal that Mr. Icon has put together, and it has little prompts in it that you can do. There's just getting a notebook. A regular notebook. There's a myriad of notebooks to choose from.
Absolutely.
I don't know about you. Do you have special notebooks that are your favorites?
I do.
Well, me too.
Yeah, I do.
The ones that I have, the ones that I just make general notes in are completely different from my journal, which is sacred. And then there's my learning book that's stuff that I've learned that's, more school based, and that's its own book. And pens.
Mm-hmm.
What about pens as a writer when you're using pen and paper? Don't touch my pen.
That's right. Do not borrow my pen. Exactly.
At home, I hide them. Because with 4 kids at the house, even university students, they'll come home, do something, and then all of a sudden, 8 pens are gone.
Oh.
Where are they gone?
Painful.
They were one. It's just a pen, Mom. Get over it. But it's not.
I do want to make a plug for engaging with others in the writing process.
That's an interesting thing.
Find a writing community, because the problem when you're writing by yourself, not journaling, but if
journaling is your own thing anyway.
Yeah, journaling's your own thing. And I think with journaling, we can really give ourselves permission to stay in that first draft, process only, no pressure environment. That's not a problem. But if you have any aspirations to write fiction, to write something to go out into the wider world, it is so easy to question our ability we have no scope for understanding the value of what we've written. We're constantly doubting ourselves as writers. And the big gift that being part of a writing community can give you is belief in yourself as a writer. A constant encouragement until you have the confidence to really trust that you have some ability and that you can put your words out there and not be ashamed of them.
And from a writing therapy point of view, that's also important, I think. If you start doing the really heavy work, it's nice to have a safe environment with people there, the people that can catch you or support you when you're going through your stuff.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it's not safe to do it on your own. It's much healthier to do it where there's people there.
And of course, your journal, your Writing for Therapeutic Value journal is a tremendous tool if you're in therapy with a therapist as well, a psychotherapist, because you have your, say, once a week or once every 2 weeks hour with your therapist. In the meantime, you can continue to process what happened in that time, other things that are happening, and you can post it or highlight areas that you want to take back into your next hour with that person and share with them, right? It's not just sort of thought and it's gone. And I wanted to remember something to tell him. What was I going to say?
Yeah.
It's there. It's explored. You can read it. I have a number of clients who bring their journals into the sessions with me, and that'll be a starting place for where we're going to work this week.
Interesting. I never thought of that, but that makes perfect sense.
There you go.
There you go. Okay, we're going to close off the show today with an interesting thought. I know a person who had quadruple bypass surgery, and before they were allowed, so to speak, to do the bypass surgery, the surgeon said that they had homework to do before the surgery, because what he found was there was a pattern of 5 years to 7 years down the road, he was getting the same patients back for the same surgery again. So what he needed was them to unpack what was making them make the choices in their life that they were making. And he asked them to write an 8.5 by 11 page every day for a week. And that increased to, by the end of it, they were writing 5 pages a day.
Wow.
Leading up to the surgery. And he said it could be about anything. This is a flowered tablecloth with pink flowers and green flowers and leaves and purple, and then there's some green. Whatever you wanted, as long as it was words on a page.
Right.
And it just shows you that there is more to this than meets the eye, that there is some real validity and some science behind how wonderful expressing yourself through writing can be and how powerful it can be.
Yeah. There's a huge thrust right now in the medical world for what they call narrative medicine, which is that the person is not just, the body with the condition on the bed. The person is their story.
There is a human being there. ACEs with children now, that they're finding the adverse childhood experiences and all the effects that it's having on the baby boomers and the adults of the world right now. There's so much to talk about. We could do this for another 2 hours. So we will do that again. At a later date, we will have another show and we'll bring Sue back and we'll delve into this even more. You've been listening to Fresh Waves here on Whistle FM. We podcast these talks so you can listen again at freshwaves.ca. I hope that everybody goes forth today and has a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And Sue, thanks for being a guest on Fresh Waves. We've really enjoyed having you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Well, that's it for Fresh Waves this week. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Some of the workshops that Sue mentions in this interview are running, but due to COVID-19 have been postponed. Others have been canceled. So it is in the world of a global pandemic. If you'd like to learn more about her workshops and or about the Amherst way of writing, simply go to inkslingers.ca. Fresh Waves is heard on Whistle FM, whistlefm.com, every Wednesday morning at 10 and Friday mornings at 10. We look forward to having you join us again soon. This is Bren Masson, wishing everyone a fabulous day.